The sound of rushing water woke me at 3 a.m. that Tuesday morning. Not the gentle lapping of Lake Serenity against the shore that I'd grown accustomed to over the years, but something far more sinister. Through my bedroom window, I could see flashlights dancing frantically in the darkness as my neighbors scrambled with sandbags and furniture. Water was pouring into basements all along the eastern shore, and above the chaos, one voice rose shriller than all the others. Karen Pemberton, our HOA president, was screaming that someone must have sabotaged the lake. The truth was far more shocking than any act of vandalism. She had caused this flood herself. Let me back up 3 months to when this whole disaster began. I'd been living in the Pine Ridge community for 15 years, in a modest cabin my grandfather built back in the 1960s. Lake Serenity was the crown jewel of our neighborhood, a pristine 20-acre body of water surrounded by private cabins and mature oak trees. Most of us had docks extending into the water, some dating back decades when the original developers encouraged waterfront access as a selling point. Everything changed when Karen Pemberton was elected HOA president last spring. She'd only moved to Pine Ridge 2 years prior, purchasing not just one cabin but 3 adjacent properties that she converted into high-end vacation rentals. From day one of her presidency, she made it clear that things were going to be different. Her campaign promise had been to restore Pine Ridge to its quote-unquote former glory, though none of us quite understood what that meant since the community had been thriving peacefully for 50 years. Her first order of business was to dig through the original HOA bylaws from 1972. She discovered an obscure clause about unauthorized structures extending into the lake. According to her interpretation, any dock built after 1975 required special HOA approval with specific documentation that, conveniently, most longtime residents no longer possessed. She sent out violation notices to 2/3 of the lakefront property owners, demanding we either produce 40-year-old permits or remove our docks within 30 days. The community was in an uproar. At the next HOA meeting, the small clubhouse was packed with angry residents. I stood up during the public comment period, introducing myself as a licensed environmental engineer with 25 years of experience in watershed management. I tried to explain that these docks had been in place for decades without issue, that they were grandfathered in by common law, and that removing them would actually cause more environmental damage than leaving them be. Karen's response was swift and condescending. She adjusted her designer glasses and spoke in that sickeningly sweet tone she used when she thought she was being clever. She said that while she appreciated my input, the rules were the rules, and if we didn't like them, we should have thought about that before buying property in an HOA-controlled community. She then revealed her master plan. Rather than forcing individual dock removals, she had found what she called a more elegant solution. She would have the lake partially drained to reset the shoreline to its original 1972 boundaries. The room erupted in protests. Tom Garrett, whose family had owned property here for 3 generations, pointed out that lowering the water level would kill the fish population and destroy the ecosystem. Sarah Kingston, a retired lawyer, questioned whether the HOA even had the authority to alter a natural water feature. But Karen had done her homework, or at least she thought she had. She produced a document from a sketchy water management company that claimed partial drainage was a routine maintenance procedure that would actually improve water quality. I knew this was complete nonsense. After the meeting, I approached several board members privately, sharing my professional assessment of what would happen if we artificially lowered the lake level. The hydrology of Lake Serenity was delicate. It was fed by underground springs and seasonal runoff, with a carefully balanced outflow through a small creek on the north end. Disrupting this balance, especially without proper engineering studies, could have catastrophic consequences. But Karen had already made up her mind. She convinced 2 other board members, both new residents who owned rental properties like her, that this was the best way to increase property values by creating more uniform shorelines. They voted 3-2 to proceed with the drainage, scheduling it for early September when they claimed water levels were naturally at their lowest. I spent the next 2 weeks documenting everything. I took photos of the current water levels, measured the dock positions, and even hired a surveyor to map the existing shoreline. I also submitted a formal written protest to the HOA board, copying the State Department of Natural Resources and our county water management district. My letter outlined in detail the potential risks of altering the lake's hydrology without proper environmental impact studies. Karen's response came via certified mail. She accused me of fear-mongering and attempting to undermine HOA authority. She also hinted that my own dock might face additional scrutiny if I continued to cause problems. The threat was clear, but I wasn't about to be intimidated by someone who thought a 2-year real estate license made her an expert in water management. The drainage began on September 5th. Karen had hired a company called Rapid Flow Solutions, which should have been the first red flag. No legitimate environmental firm would have a name that sounded like a drain cleaning service. They showed up with portable pumps and began siphoning water from the lake into temporary holding ponds, claiming they would release it slowly into the creek system. Within 3 days, the water level had dropped by 4 feet. Docks that had once floated gracefully now sat awkwardly on exposed mud. The smell of rotting vegetation filled the air as previously submerged plant matter baked in the late summer sun. Fish began dying in the shallows, and the residents were furious. But Karen remained unmoved. She posted cheerful updates on the HOA Facebook page about the exciting shoreline restoration project and how beautiful our uniform beaches would be. What she didn't account for was the weather. The second week of September brought something our region hadn't seen in 5 years. A tropical depression stalled over our state, dumping 8 inches of rain in 36 hours. Under normal circumstances, Lake Serenity could handle this influx easily. The excess water would flow out through the creek, and the underground springs would maintain equilibrium. But with the lake level artificially lowered and the natural flow patterns disrupted, we had a disaster in the making. I noticed the problem first on September 14th, a Wednesday evening. The creek that normally carried overflow from the lake was running backward. The heavy rains had overwhelmed the downstream capacity, and with the lake level so low, water was actually flowing into our basin from the surrounding watershed. I immediately called the emergency HOA hotline, but it went to voicemail. I then tried Karen's cell phone, which she'd grudgingly shared at a previous meeting. She answered on the 5th ring with an annoyed tone, clearly irritated at being disturbed during dinner. I explained the situation as calmly as possible, using simple terms she could understand. The lake was essentially becoming a catch basin for all the runoff from higher elevations. With the natural overflow mechanisms disrupted by the drainage, water would accumulate rapidly and unpredictably. We needed to stop the pumps immediately and open any emergency spillways. Her response was exactly what I feared. She accused me of trying to sabotage her project and suggested I was exaggerating the situation to make her look bad. She said the drainage company had assured her they'd accounted for rain events and that I should stop pretending to be smarter than the professionals she'd hired. Then she hung up on me. I spent that night moving everything important to the 2nd floor of my cabin and helping my elderly neighbors do the same. By dawn, my predictions had come true with a vengeance. The lake level had risen 6 feet in 8 hours, but not uniformly. The disrupted hydrology caused water to surge toward the eastern shore, where the land was naturally lower. And what properties were located on the eastern shore? Karen's 3 rental cabins, all recently renovated with finished basements and expensive furnishings. The scene that morning was chaos. Water poured into the lower levels of a dozen properties, but Karen's rentals bore the brunt of it. Her tenants, a mix of vacationing families and business travelers, were evacuating in panic. Thousands of dollars of furniture floated in muddy water. The newly installed hardwood floors buckled and warped. And there was Karen, standing knee-deep in floodwater, screaming into her phone at the drainage company while mascara ran down her cheeks. The fire department arrived first, followed by county emergency management. They immediately asked who was responsible for altering the lake levels. Every finger pointed to Karen. I provided the officials with copies of all my documentation, including the warnings I'd submitted weeks earlier. The fire chief, a no-nonsense woman named Captain Rodriguez, looked at the papers, then at Karen, and shook her head in disgust. By noon, insurance adjusters were crawling over the affected properties. The initial damage estimates were staggering. Over $2 million in property damage, not counting the environmental destruction. The State Department of Natural Resources arrived that afternoon, and they were not happy. Altering a natural water body without permits was a serious violation. The fact that it resulted in property damage made it even worse. An emergency HOA meeting was called for that evening. The clubhouse was standing room only, with flood victims demanding answers. Karen tried to maintain her composure, claiming the flooding was an act of God that no one could have predicted. That's when I stood up and presented my evidence. Emails showing Karen had been warned repeatedly. Meeting minutes where she dismissed expert concerns. The contract with Rapid Flow Solutions that specifically excluded liability for weather-related events. The crowd turned hostile. Tom Garrett made a motion for an immediate vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. Sarah Kingston seconded it. The vote was unanimous. Even Karen's previous allies abandoned her. She was removed as HOA president effective immediately. But that was just the beginning of her troubles. The State Water Agency launched a formal investigation. 2 weeks later, they issued their findings. Karen had violated 3 different environmental regulations. The fines totaled $75,000. Additionally, she was personally liable for the drainage costs and any restoration efforts, which engineers estimated would run another $100,000. Her insurance company, after reviewing the documentation showing she'd ignored professional warnings, denied her claim. The civil lawsuits began rolling in by October. Every flooded property owner sought damages. Her own tenants sued for lost belongings and ruined vacations. The total claims exceeded $500,000. Karen's lawyer, probably the only person still willing to work with her, advised her to settle quickly before criminal charges were considered. I was elected to the HOA board at the next regular meeting, tasked with overseeing the lake restoration project. We hired a legitimate environmental firm to develop a restoration plan. It would take months to undo the damage Karen had caused in weeks. The fish population would need to be restocked. The shoreline vegetation replanted. The natural flow patterns carefully re-established. 3 weeks after the flood, as we were beginning the restoration work, I received a forwarded email that perfectly captured the irony of the situation. One of Karen's former tenants had sent her a formal demand for $8,000 in flood damages. Attached to the email was a photo that made me laugh out loud. There, floating in the muddy aftermath of Karen's rental cabin, was a laminated HOA sign that read "No unauthorized docks allowed." The same sign Karen had posted all around the lake just months earlier. The final financial toll was devastating for Karen. Between the state fines, legal settlements, and restoration costs, she owed over $700,000. She was forced to sell all 3 rental properties at a loss. Word around town was that she'd also lost her real estate license after the state board reviewed her reckless behavior. At the final court hearing, when the judge read out the total penalties, Karen's face went white as a sheet. She stammered something about unfair treatment before her lawyer quickly silenced her. That was the last time anyone in Pine Ridge saw Karen Pemberton.